Well, hello. It shows you that there's some bird song there. Welcome to the Rhetoric Prof stream. Haven't done this in a while. And looking forward to reading this piece with you tonight. Let me get this a little bit better situated here. So it's not kind of being I mean, it was fine, but maybe we could zoom in a bit. Let's see how that goes. Zoom in, friends. Take some time to zoom in. And that's what this is really about. This is close reading a piece tonight. And I think that you'll enjoy it. I'm going to turn down the music a little bit. Maybe we can leave it on, though. It's kind of nice. Yeah. Turn this down a little bit, too. All right. We're good to go. Get rid of that. Okay. Well, welcome to the stream. My name's Tim. I'm a professor of rhetoric, or, some people call me that. And this stream is dedicated to thinking about rhetoric and speech and meaning and those kinds of things. But really also whatever. So if you are here and you're in the chat, and you have something you want to talk about, we're talking about talking. So anything will fit tonight especially. And this piece I was reminded of recently in talking with a friend of the channel, a certain Irish friend of mine. And I hadn't thought about it in a long time, and I was kind of reading it at the beginning. Read a few pages of it, and all this stuff was coming to me that from the first time I read to it that seemed really relevant to what I've been talking about in classes and with friends and just a lot of people. So I thought it might be a good one to put on the stream and see what happens when we talk about it together. So this is a piece. It's actually published in an academic journal, which is quite unusual in both directions, that I like it this much, or I think that I do from what I remember of it, and just how it sounds. It doesn't sound like an academic piece. I mean, there are places where it might, a little bit more than others, but it seems just like someone writing, and that's a real nice change of pace, let me tell you. So let's check it out. Let's dive right in. Talking by Cyril Welch. We talk all the time. Well, I sure do, anyway. That is, one of us says something and another hears it in the course of getting things done, or passing one another in the intervals between. I don't think I need this. Can I just get rid of that? There we go. Now it's too far in that direction. All right, 1 second. There we go. Okay, that's fine. All right. Getting things done like this, rearranging the windows. In the course of getting things done or passing one another in the intervals between. Yet we do not always succeed in talking with one another. And much of the time, we might not even desire to do so. You ever get that feeling when you're kind of like, gosh, I really just want this to be over as fast as possible. I'm going to turn this off, actually. But I'll keep that on. Let me know how you feel about the bird song. I don't know. Maybe it's a bit odd. Sometimes, however, we do succeed, and other times we do desire but fail. Sometimes, perhaps, in talking with our parents and later our children, with a friend in a pub or a colleague at work, something of significance transpires in the talk which is memorable, which might even set standards for further talk. And whatever the significance of the content, the very fact that we talked with one another, and the fact that we actually focused on something together, may engender wonder. Correlatively, the more profoundly we have talked with one another, the less easily we will settle for talk, which falls short of such dialogue. So, right at the beginning of the semester, the talk about small talk came up in a lot of my classes, what small talk does, and I was giving the line that, well, there might be a lot of value in small talk. It's what anthropologists call, and linguists sometimes call, phatic communication, with a PH. And phatic communication, there's this idea that it's maintaining channels. It's kind of doing social work. It's not really about the content of what you're saying, but it is about the relationship that you're having from doing these things. And even though we maybe associate small talk with a very superficial kind of relationship, the least intense kind of relationship you have, just civility, mere civility, really. Not every culture organizes its phatic communication in that way. There are griots who have these kinds of elaborate forms of greeting that go through all of these very complicated social dynamics and feelings, and it's an art form in itself, just greeting people. So it depends on where you are. But at the same time, that superficiality that we feel with small talk is kind of maybe one of the things that this is about, that this piece is trying to address. Why does sometimes it feel so superficial, even outside of those moments when it's obviously just a gesture? Why does talk sometimes still feel superficial? What would it mean for it to not feel so kind of thin as it sometimes does? In general, reflective thought and discourse arises about something because that something occasionally works and often does not. We got a problem, folks. That cooperative human enterprise at times comes off and at times does not. That some things humanly made can stand at the center of our lives rather than simply pass through them. That sometimes we seem actually to know something, whereas much of our pretension to knowledge is shameful sham. It's a nice little bit of a... I don't even know what to call it. It's like rhyme, or it's beyond alliteration. It's nice. I know that there's a word I should know for that, but I don't. That some, speaking of pretensions to knowledge, that some written works embody rather than simply serve life. That there are occasions when the entire human condition, and correlatively all creation, appears sacred and elicit devotion, while much piety dwindles into bigotry. Oh, I like that line. Ain't that the case? Much piety dwindles into bigotry, where it becomes kind of a defense of the something, a very narrow God. And really that only a God that's so narrow can only be defined through negation. And of course, I don't mean God here literally, but sometimes it could be, of course. Also, sometimes literally, gods. These and such like contrasts lead us to think about the difference, and so give birth to philosophy of politics, of art, of knowledge, of literature, of religion, or whatever. Philosophy of whatever is my favorite subject. As used to be said, reflection begins in wonder. In retrospect, we behold the plenitude with astonishment and with gratitude, and ask ourselves how we might maintain it. Yeah. The plenitude of what? What do we hold the plenitude of that makes us wonder, astonishment? Should we already know this at this point in the reading? I'm not sure. Is it what he was talking about before? Maybe. In an age such as ours, bent upon solidifying frameworks rather than liberating the possibilities within the frameworks, we might well understand Heidegger's emendation. So Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, the famous, infamous philosopher, emendation, a kind of change. Well, what was he changing? Reflection begins in horror. He's taking away the idea, the classical idea, that reflection begins in wonder. No, it begins in horror at the prospects of vacuity in politics, in artwork, in science, in literature, in religion, or whatever. I like the whatevers at the end of these. It's better than etc. It's a little bit more natural sounding than etc., but it's also kind of funny. But whether in wonder or in horror, reflection genuinely begins and continues only as the contrast between plenitude and vacuity draws us into a long, hard, and second look at the phenomena themselves. So reflective moments. I mean, this is obviously a reflective piece. There's really no reason. You don't have to he's talking about kind of human endeavor, like getting things done. This is not something we read to get things done. In case you happen to accidentally come here and think we were going to get something done. No, I'm sorry. You could go to another stream or something where they're doing things. The drops are unlimited today. Thank you, Prime subs. Things might be getting done on other streams. I don't really know, but here nothing is getting done. But there are things to do when we're not doing anything. And one of those might be reflection. It comes out of this feeling of wonder, of horror. I wonder if those are the only possibilities. I kind of hope not. Obviously I prefer the wonder to the horror, but I have found myself reflecting sometimes out of the horror of just how kind of like, it doesn't feel like there's much there where there should be something. Different moments in life. So, what happens when we really talk with one another? Talking which manifests the with, rather than the indifferent talk evident in the conduct of our business, and in passing the time. It manifests the with. Well, I said that this doesn't sound like an academic article, but it's certainly a kind of elevated philosophical language. But is he using that language just because, just to be a kind of smarty pants, just kind of show off? I don't think so. I mean, I don't get that feeling. Maybe you do, but I get the feeling that he is trying to express something that requires using language in a way that's a little bit different than how we would normally use it, because he's trying to think a thought that's different than what we normally think. He's trying to think about talking. We don't usually do that. And that's something that reflection does. Reflection isn't just a kind of posture where you put your head in your hand. Obviously, it's not that. And it's a kind of activity, but it's an activity that, if we look at the language of it, might often look that way. And some people might see that as philosophical, and sometimes it might be philosophical, but it doesn't even need to really be philosophical. It just needs to be a kind of questioning happening in language. It might be one way to think about the kind of reflection we're talking about here. And talk is distinct from the speech which is written alone and in silence, and which should be read alone and without the interruption of others. I wonder what he's imagining there. He sounds kind of cranky. He's like his kids keep interrupting him. But certainly there are some things that should be read differently than others. I used to assign one book. I don't assign it anymore. But I used to assign one book, and I would say, you have to read this in one sitting. It's very short. You need to read it in a single sitting. I don't say things like that anymore because, you never know what's going on with people. I try to be less presumptuous, but I don't think it's helping. Anyway, I mean, I still think that even though I don't say that you have to read this in one sitting kind of thing, that the people who did read it in one sitting would tell me often that they were glad that I said that because it did affect them differently. They felt that it would have been different if they kind of read it in chunks, read it in a kind of way where you graze over the words or something, here and there, doing different things. We talk with one another only when we can play with what we are talking about. With a question, with a proposal, with something real, or perhaps even with the reality of the real. Really, to talk with one another, we must both speak and listen, simultaneously, even though our mouths might not all operate at the same time. Just as football players on the field all play the game at once, even though only one carries the ball at any one time. I mean, I think that metaphor is okay, but I wonder if maybe the metaphor plays a bit too much. I don't think he's imagining this, but I think many people would imagine it as a kind of competition. That's why, that's what's going on. Someone's playing offense, someone's playing defense. I don't know. I mean, I think he's trying to just say that there's always activity happening, that everyone is kind of actively participating, even when they're not talking in talk. If it's really real talk, And thus we do not talk to one another when one or the other persists, either in asserting himself as a professional seeking personal victory at all costs. And you said there he talks against this idea of kind of treating it as a competition. Or in affirming the speaker, as a student or disciple adulating a master. We talk with one another only on those occasions where what we are talking about hovers ahead of us and gradually takes shape for all of us. Where we in effect discover only at the end of the discussion the topic which got the discussion started. I really like that idea. I mean, sometimes I feel like it even goes further than that, where at the end of the discussion you realize a kind of opening for another discussion that you can't have. Like a really beautiful conversation, these memorable ones, rarely end in a place where we've arrived at the end. Most of the time in my life, it's like part of the bittersweet beauty of a really great conversation is that it kind of has to end arbitrarily or artificially. Like it comes to a certain close, but it can't really finish. But someone needs to leave, a train is coming. Something like that. It's getting dark. The weather's changing. The conversation has to end. And you can feel all the possibilities of how it could continue as you go home your own way. That's my sense of what this kind of talk is like, that he's imagining. A good listener, we say, must tolerate the opinions of others, must be open to new ideas. Yet tolerance and openness in themselves may be only social courtesies. One remains silent while the other speaks, and one continues to respect the speaker himself, even if he seems to utter nonsense, that is, what appears to make no sense at the time. Such courtesy may come as a welcome relief. given the hostility which often arises in discussions. But tolerance and openness with regard to our interlocutors, just people we're talking with, do not decide whether we are talking with one another, whether a genuine conversation takes place. It's not enough to just be open. Be like, no, I'm very open-minded. You're so open-minded it kind of doesn't really stay there. It just kind of comes in and out, It's like front door, back door kind of situation with sometimes you feel with some people who make such a kind of virtue out of their open-mindedness that they do it at the expense of their consideration or their conviction or taking a position, even kind of the generosity of not acquiescing to everything that someone says. It's a bit kind of, it would be a kind of, how to say, a kind of aggressive hospitality where you'd be someone's guest and they would do nothing but wait upon you. Like if their life didn't continue while you were living with them, or like while you're staying with them even a little bit, like if it was all about you all the time, if there was never a break, that would be, I think, quite overwhelming and maybe not very hospitable. A conversation can be like that too if somebody is just like, yeah, of course, to everything that you say. There's not enough resistance for anything to develop or grow. But tolerance, I already said that. I can discipline myself in such courtesies without really entering into dialogue with others. Courteous comportment relates me to my fellows, not to the topic of discourse. It is a social rather than an ontological virtue. It's about who we are rather than about what is. And I don't know if I accept that distinction he's making quite so easily, but I don't know if that kills the peace for me and what he's trying to say. We really talk with one another only when what we are talking about gradually comes into view. Or maybe I should say, when what we're talking about gradually comes into view. Like it's kind of, maybe the emphasis here is on the gradually. Within hearing, for both or all of us. Such discourse strains us, takes time. In effect, we cannot possibly know what we are talking about. The virtue, isn't that a nice idea? And he's going to develop it a fair bit. That serious conversation is conversation where we can't know what we're talking about. We can't know what we're talking about fully. It can't have already been mastered. If it's already mastered, then why are we talking about it? The virtue required to sustain one in such talk is not so much tolerance of others as tolerance of oneself, of one's own ignorance. A person absolutely incapable of living in his ignorance, his own uncertainty, his own insecurity, can never talk with one another, no matter how well he practices the social virtues. He can be very courteous, but if you're not able of, and here he's describing something that reminds me a lot of what the poet John Keats called negative capability. The ability to kind of be in uncertainty without a kind of tense grasping after certainty, certitude, fact. You don't have to grab at it so much. You can kind of be there. Something can live there. I have to say I really associate that quality in people with maturity. That someone who doesn't possess that, no matter what age they are, does not appear to me as a mature person. It's related to a sense of what education should provide. And it's odd if we think about education just as knowledge, just kind of knowing things. It's a kind of education that leads to lifelong immaturity. It makes people incapable of having that, at least in my sense of it, the maturity to remain in uncertainty. Because they see knowing as the virtue, and they say ignorance in this kind of simplistic way is what's bad. It needs to be hidden or run away from or filled in. To toy with an idea, a thought, a proposal, a question, or an answer, to be open to that which it frames. One can hardly presume to know in advance what will come about or come into view, any more than in a boxing match or a football game. I've been thinking recently about, I do occasionally watch old boxing matches. And there's something about boxing that makes it more viewable past boxing matches than other past sporting events. But I was talking to my mother recently. She's like, "You watch the game?" I'm like, "I haven't been able to watch the games in years. I don't have cable." So, but I could go and find it afterwards, but there's absolutely no interest in almost any televised sporting event after it airs. The value of it drops. It's like yesterday's newspaper. It's kind of part of the news. So, I mean, I don't think he means it in the exact same way here, but there's a kind of way in which the knowledge of what happened in the game, makes even the experience of it not so valuable. There's lots of sitcom plots about someone telling them what happened in a game while they're videotaping it, and these kinds of things, right? It's a source of comedy. Everybody knows this. And if what does come into view or within hearing, bodes any future, there may be no time, unlike in a boxing match or a football game, at which we could rightly claim to know absolutely what we are talking about. Genuine talk sustains us precisely in as much as it remains promising. Promising, I think, here in a double sense. Promising both as in promising, kind of like, something there, but also like it's promising. It's promissory notes. It's about the future. I owe you. It's not all fulfilled. It's not transactional. Transaction's complete at the moment of its exchange. It's done. Provides us with a future as well as with a present, something to be pursued as much as something to be attained. If I already know what I am talking about, I can only speak to inform and listen only to correct. I cannot toy with anything. I cannot talk with another. The need for ignorance, for willingness to live within one's ignorance, uncertainty and insecurity accounts for the rarity of good discussion. A father cannot talk with his child unless he can credit the child with seeing or hearing, thinking or imagining something he himself has so far missed. I'm not sure why he says father specifically here. I don't think that's necessary, but I do think that's a kind of nice insight about how adults often relate to children. People definitely talk down to children, and I think some people get confused with this when you say, "Oh, well, how could you talk down to a child? They just know less." You have to talk down to them or dumb it down, as people openly say when they talk to children. What they're forgetting is that the way that the child sees the world, what a rich source of insight. And not just in this kind of sentimental way where we say things like, "Oh, out of the mouths of babes, they're so innocent, they see things how they truly are." No, they don't see things how they truly are, but they do have insight and creativity, and they understand things that you can't because you're past that moment of your development. And to talk with them not as an equal in every respect, but as equally capable of insight is, I think, important when you're talking to children, however young. A professor can talk with a student only if he credits the student with insight, which he himself lacks. I mean, same idea goes there, but this is probably even rarer in some places than adults talking to children this way. Professors really like to, I heard a few stories recent this week that are making me feel, anyway, I'm not going to spend too long on that because I don't want this to be listen to the bird song. We don't need too much spleen here. Colleagues, academic or otherwise, have the greatest difficulty in talking with one another, since they severally owe their positions precisely to their claims to knowledge. Yeah. That's a good insight. It's a good insight. Nobody can kind of like claim to not know anything. Like, well, of course I've read XYZ. There's that funny part of that David Lodge novel where they're playing an academic game of like, oh, what's the thing you haven't read? All these English professors, what's the thing that you haven't read? And the one guy says Hamlet, and like it causes this huge problem. And not because they're like, oh God, how you couldn't have read Hamlet. They just don't believe that it even makes sense that he couldn't have read it. They're just like, it's inconceivable. And it like ruins the party. Academics, what can you do? On the other hand, we become friends with those with whom we can talk, with those to whom we can admit our ignorance freely and fearlessly, and whom we can generally credit with having ideas, thoughts, proposals worthy of play. Perhaps lovers go farther than friends inasmuch as each finds himself only when fully and unreservedly engaged in the talk of the other. I wonder how other people would respond to that, because I that does ring true for me, but that seems like a place where it might be quite different for many people, that that the place of talk in love relations might need a bit more investigation than he's willing to give it here. But Anyway, I think we also know that the intimacy that you can have in a love relationship through talk is distinct and distinctive and can be really a beautiful and important part of love. Yet how much does talk fail in all these instances? Parents do not so much talk as bark, while children whine. Teachers lecture or assign, and students pout or fawn. Colleagues bicker or resort to chit-chat, good-natured or otherwise. Yeah. And lovers reproach one another. So we see all these failures of talk. People not talking well, not because they lack eloquence or big vocabulary, not because they don't know things, just the opposite, because they're not willing to not know things. This is why talk fails. I think that's a nice thesis. I wonder what you think about it. Let me know. But what is this ignorance which seems to condition our talking with one another? Certainly not just a lack of information, a gap in the store of facts at our disposal. Precisely to talk well with a child, a parent must know something. Say, the rules of hygiene or of social conduct, the names and properties of plants and animals. And if a teacher is hired to teach Greek philosophy, he must know what Plato said. Well, he ought to. We would even like to have something at our fingertips which can contribute to the focus of our talk with friends and lovers. The ignorance necessary for talking with one another, for playing with ideas, thoughts, proposals, questions, must be an ignorance of what might be made of the knowledge which we said to have. What might be made of the knowledge. Yeah, note that. That's the key bit. What might be made of the knowledge which we can be said to have. What can be made of it in the course of the talk. I like that question a lot. I don't know. It probably brands me as incredibly American. But I like to ask the question, what do you make of that? A lot. Sometimes in classes. Sometimes just in conversation. What do you make of that? Which is a kind of way of passing the ball back, in a way. But it also is a gesture to open the conversation to that register. What do you make of this thing that we know? Or that we don't know? Well, some few do seem to experience difficulty in owning up to their ignorance about what is established. Facts, names, calculations, customs, achievements of peers and ancestors. The matter, so to speak, of talk. Most do not. The greatest difficulty arises in owning up to one's own ignorance of what to make of what is established, of the way it may take on unsuspected significance, emerge differently, appear in a new light as time goes on. This is such an important part of my just general experience, that this does happen. The faith that this happens, and continuously and always, and without me pressing it or trying to do much, without it just happens, is such a source of comfort in my own life. It's hard to imagine living without that faith. That there will always be some unsuspected significance. But it's also kind of horrifying. To speak a little bit about some kitschy pop culture stuff, there's this Calvin and Hobbes strip where whenever they get philosophical, they start going down the down the cliff with his wagon, and then as they're flying over the top. So Calvin's kind of thinking about his place in the universe. He's very pessimistic. It's after his namesake, John Calvin. And as they're kind of both flying over, so they have to be hurtling to their deaths, but there's going to be a Monday strip. So even though this is the Sunday one, the Monday one's just going to start back on this is kind of the end of the week. And they're flying off, and Calvin says something like, or Hobbes says something like, well, which is worse, if everything matters or nothing does? And I kind of like that question, which is worse. Sometimes it can be horrifying that things, if you were to think, oh God, everything matters, it could be this kind of anxious, crippling anxiety that can come from that idea. And so sometimes it might be nice to take comfort in the fact that, whatever that significance is, it's not significant beyond to the people it's significant to. So there's no absolute significance to anything at the same time. you might say. A lot of people disagree with that, but we can argue it out if you want. We can, of course, lack information. We may fail to inform ourselves or be informed about data and statistics, names of things and quotations from the works of authors, rules of human behavior and patterns of natural events, and even if such information has at one time come our way, it may slip our minds, remain, or become confused in the passage of time. When we speak of ignorance, we likely have some such lack or distortion of information in view. And sometimes our talk with one another does depend on this common variety of ignorance. On such occasions, talking with one another means, at least in part, informing one another. Here a good listener carefully heeds and accurately registers the formulations of another, while a good speaker must not only have the information at his fingertips, but also enunciate clearly and develop a sensitivity to the listener's ability and disposition to receive the information. Now this seems like kind of maybe an obvious statement or maybe even a bit flat, but there's something in here that I really like and I want to point out. A good listener carefully heeds and accurately registers the formulations of another. So often when someone does inform us or instruct us about something and they give us a fact or one of these things that he names the rule of human behavior, we hear it as that. We hear it as, when we evaluate it and we receive it as the truth of the thing. But really what we should be evaluating it is as the speech of another. Speech which is in a world that is part of who that person is. But we're always listening to speech, and we're evaluating that. The character of speech might be very different in different times, but we're listening to speech. And if we forget that, we get confused. We start to make all sorts of strange errors. We start to respond to things as if they're stimuli rather than significances. While a good speaker must not only have the information at his fingertips, but also enunciate clearly and develop a sensitivity to the listener's ability and disposition to receive the information. So you got to adapt it. But what about the other kind of ignorance? How can we genuinely distinguish between an ignorance of information and an ignorance of what to make of the information? Or does this other ignorance simply invite us to organize information, as teachers may expect their pupils to do during an examination? Is making something out of information simply another skill we may learn, a kind of knowledge which only practice could affect? In effect, he means like make happen here, which would defy outright transfer from speaker to listener. If so, then we would have even less occasion, need, or ability to talk with one another. We could only put on a display or witness one. There would be no dialogue. So he's saying if this possibility didn't exist, there's no talk. There's just kind of rituals. That's a bold formulation, don't you think? If parents and children, teachers and students, friends and colleagues, and lovers can indeed talk profoundly with one another, and if such talk presupposes a profound distinction between ignorance of information and ignorance of what to make of information, such talk must reflect a duality within the human condition itself. Making lots of ideas connect here. It must depend or feed upon, but also bring to light or nourish a distinction between how things easily and ordinarily, and therefore quite rightly appear, and how things arduously and extraordinarily, and therefore, from the ordinary standpoint, quite wrongly appear. When we finally do talk with one another, things appear differently. So, I don't know too much about Cyril Welch. And by too much, I don't know anything about him. Though I did look at his website earlier today very briefly and was surprised by it. I'd have to go check it out a little bit more. Maybe I'll send him an email or something. But he seems like an interesting guy. And beyond that, I also think that he is probably a professor of some kind, or maybe an independent scholar. I'm not totally sure. Really, I told you I didn't know anything about him. But what he's saying here reminds me of a kind of ancient Greek idea that is hard to put into English, because so many of the words that we have a slightly different character to them. But a lot of when you see in a Greek text, and it translates it as opinion, or sometimes as belief even, is the word doxa or doxa, or however you might say it. And we tend to use that word, the doxastic, to refer mostly to belief. But there, like the verbal form of it, dokein, simply means to appear. It's how things appear to people, which is a bit different than belief. Because we do have this possibility, as he says, of talk, of within our own shared sense of how things do appear, we can also say, well, they don't appear rightly. That there's another appearance, that they ought to appear in some other way. And I think it's that distinction, that development of, were we to use the flat English idea of it, of opinion, into a better opinion, we wouldn't quite capture what is really happening there as well, as if we said something like developing from things, how things tend to appear to how they might appear, or how things seem to appear to how they do appear. So we never leave the realm of appearance. Like, we don't say behind appearance there's what really truly is, and appearance is deceitful. That I don't think would get us very far in talk most of the time, though someone might hold out that position as their own way that things appear to them, sure. But it's a question of how we relate to appearance, which appearances we bring forth, and how we're able to make things appear to one another. And we're doing that in talk. Things are appearing in talk, not visual images in our words, though visual images come in how we process language and how we think. And in that sense, a world is partly appearing visually, but it's appearing in meaning. What's an object of concern? What do things mean to us? And how might they mean otherwise? So there's possibility in appearance, not just actuality. And that's very hard to capture in the way it appears to us that belief and opinion work as subjective, individual, the process of deliberation and decision, rather than discourse, imagination, possibility. When we finally do talk with one another, things appear differently. The precondition for such talk is that we let ourselves in on that difference, that we cultivate rather than extirpate it. Yet the difference so much conditioning our talk escapes any effort to determine it fully in advance. In advance, we can only make clear the first appearance, not the reappearance. Thus we participate in such talk ignorantly. In short, we can only play with the proposal initiating the discussion, accepting our ignorance of the outcome. We must exercise our imagination long before we exercise our judgment. Some of the most reflective discourse, what used to be called primary philosophy, concentrates on the duality of the human condition itself, the duality conditioning any good talk. In philosophizing profoundly with one another, we ask how it is that our ordinary lives, perceptions, thoughts, encounters might be pregnant with the extraordinary, how the pregnancy might run its course, and what may come of it for good or for ill. However, we can see the difference already operating in pre-philosophical ways, each of which sustains one kind of talk. Now, this part, I don't love this kind of adulation of the philosophical as over against the pre-philosophical that takes its value from approaching the philosophical. But many people, and it seems like, unfortunately, Cyril Welch might also think this way, that the philosophy is where we're doing this. I'm not so sure I want to call that philosophy, where we're doing talk. I think that gives the sense to people that it's this kind of attitude of like what really matters are ideas or what's general. I think that would kind of be, in addition to being wrong, would also give the wrong impression of the value that ideas take in real talk, is that it becomes filled with what's concrete, becomes filled with life, like in a Dostoevsky novel, where it's not the idea in general that matters at all. The idea in general often, is something that confuses somebody in his works, like Raskolnikov. He's someone who gets absolutely turned around by misunderstanding abstract ideas, or thinking about that as what really matters, and then he tries to kind of live it, and everything goes awry. Anyway, that's maybe far-flung. However, we can see the difference already operating in pre-philosophical talk. Okay. For instance, discussions of one type hinge upon the distinction between publicly announced policy within institutions, within, say, a university, a state, or a church, and behind-the-scenes intentions or power struggles. How much barroom or clubroom talk, perhaps even dining room talk, draws upon this version of the difference between appearance and reality. Oh, you know what's really going on at the business. There's a merger and acquisition in the works, and they're just putting in all this sunny stuff because, they don't want all the rats to leave the ship. This kind of ideas. We do experience the world partly this way. You would be quite naive if you never had any recognition that there is this distinction between the talk that's private and the talk that's public, and how that affects public talk. At a certain stage of life, generally someone in our youth or again in our old age, we become, as one says, cynical, believing that the announced and the intended differ absolutely. That no one can ever say anything true. Everyone's a hypocrite, that kind of attitude. Discussions of another type draw upon the difference between the current, easy or shallow ways of receiving the accomplishments of others and the pointed, difficult, or deep ways of understanding their accomplishments. There are current or exoteric ways of receiving the results of science, the doctrines of the church, the ideologies of nations, and the texts of poets and philosophers. Much intellectual discussion explores the possibility of more pointed or esoteric ways of engaging in what various results, doctrines, ideologies, or texts bespeak. So, what is he talking about here? I think there's lots of different examples, but it might be in and I find many of these quite interesting. I'm curious what he'll say about them, if anything at all. But you might have someone who's quite religious, but as an apologist of their religion, defends an interpretation of their religion that is maybe not orthodox, where they say, well, yes, of course, these things are said, but we have to understand that God is really not, is part of the energy of the world or something like this. They have an exoteric interpretation that allows them to meet some of the other challenges that they might face from people who don't believe them, or might just be their way of relating to it. It's the way that feels right to them. So there's lots of different ways that people can interpret things that are carrying and have more popular modes. And we would recognize one as maybe being more standard or mainstream or basic or whatever, and one as being more, as he calls it, exoteric or different. Yet a third kind of talk depends on the distinction between the ways things happen to be, or esoteric, not exoteric, sorry. Yet a third kind of talk depends on the distinction between the ways things happen to be and the way they should be. We talk to one another about birch trees or houses or human beings, examining given instances and commenting on how these instances should have developed. Or we look at an institution such as our own university and distinguish between the de facto shape it has taken and the de jure shape it should take. With the fall of teleology, the idea that there are natural ends to things, that we have eyes in order to see. And you might say, okay, we kind of do, but it wasn't intended by anyone that way. It kind of developed that way, So has teleology really fallen? Maybe not so much. We'll see. With the fall of teleology, intellectuals have shied away from talking about inborn purposes and have preferred to reduce the distinction between the is and the ought to the individual's concern for his own integrity, on the one hand, and his desires, on the other. Notwithstanding this historical reduction to subjectivity, much good discussion among artisans and professionals presumes that our conception of a better tree, a better house, a better human being, or a better university has a foothold in the nature of things, and that our job is to help given instances of, say, birch trees, live up to our grounded conception of them. Yeah, he's kind of making fun here, I think, a little bit of this, what we might call Platonic point of view of, the ideal is the real real fails to be ideal, that kind of thing. Now, the life of such discussions depends upon our willingness to uphold the difference between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Talk about the discrepancy between announced policy and inner intentions turns sour the moment we assume the two should somehow coincide immediately. Such talk can only issue in disgust and resentment, not a discovery of one's own participation in and responsibility for institutional life. Similarly, we implicitly deny the foundations of discourse if we assume that the deep or esoteric understanding of scientific work, of church doctrine or political ideology, or of literary texts should be laid bare once and for all to see, that it should become exoteric, that is, kind of it's available now. Its meaning is out, public, accessible. And all talk would come to an end if birch trees, houses, human beings, and universities automatically lived up to their potentialities. Instead of aspiring to eliminate the difference, a good talk builds it out. Attends carefully to our involvement in the ordinary and our destiny to make something out of the ordinary. Again, that idea of making something out of the ordinary here. So would utopia be silent? Is that what he's saying? There would be no... Well, it doesn't mean that there would be no discourse. There'd be no talk, because even if there are no problems, there might be things to do, things that we have to kind of maintain, keep things running. But here he's talking about this kind of talk that deals with what we don't know, these problematic matters and concerns of life. It would follow that when we really talk with one another, our talk is not so much about something as of it. We do not so much point something out as embody the drama of it. We do not so much determine how things already are as make something out of prevailing determinations, show how these determinations open us onto something. Such talk takes time. There are three things that we must talk out: the two sides of the difference, and then the interplay between the two. Now, here he's kind of slipping in a little bit of that old dialectic. The two sides of the difference and the interplay between the two. Genuine talk here is dialectical. It's dialogical, but it's also dialectical. What is dialectic? God, no one has ever asked me this question, and yet I always feel the need to answer it. What is a dialectic? But I do a lot of my work on dialectic that is hard to explain why I care so much about it, because stuff I'm looking at, even to people who might care about it, people who are historians of these time periods that I'm reading this stuff in, even to them it's hard to explain why this stuff really matters. It seems like a bunch of outdated, logical, kind of like loosely logical stuff. These textbooks and manuals of dialectic in European history. But when I think about I do see a relationship between these old-timey traditions of dialectic, whether they're humanist or Hegelian or Marxist, these traditions of dialectic, and this thing that he's talking about here, that can happen anytime people are really talking to each other, which is that we go back to this idea of appearances. We get the impression that there is this division in things. There's the A, and then there's the not A. There's things as they are, or there's things as they should be. All these distinctions that he just laid out. But in talking about it, we kind of maybe sometimes come to the part that as we start to play between these different ideas, we see that the problem comes from the distinction itself. That the distinction is problematic. And that's, for me, the real heart of a dialectical sensibility. This distinction is problematic. It doesn't mean that, therefore, they're unified. It's actually just one thing. Or that these things don't exist. It's the question of what is the relationship between these things is not obvious. We have to talk it out. Even the relationship between them. We can't just assume that we already know what these relationships are. So, anyway, that's a bit of a digression on dialectic. Okay. Get to that later. Such talk takes time. Blah, 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 blah. But it not only takes time, it changes it. Time comes to mean something else when we engage in a good discussion. For one thing, we do not look at our watches. The passage of time goes unnoticed. This has also come up a lot in my classes recently, where we've been discussing the difference between absolute time, clock time, how time is being filled by our activity, versus activity being the kind of time. Oh, what am I doing? Well, it takes a certain amount of time to do these things. And the clock has us all kind of jumping around and acting in a way that people from non-clock cultures would find probably quite amusing and strange and odd, maybe terrifying. Who knows what they would think? But definitely different from how they act. And here we kind of return to that non-clock time, where the time is in the thing, it's not filling in some absolute empty time. For one thing, we do know that not look at our watches. However, in enacting the drama between the ordinary and the extraordinary, our talk becomes decidedly temporal in another sense. The established reverberates with the unestablished. The settled appears unsettled. The already rocks with the possible. Oh, I like that. That's a nice one. The already rocks with the possible. In a word, the past becomes our context for the future. The future becomes our promise for the past. And a present evolves, in which both we ourselves and our topic can fully be, and be in unison, for the duration. Our talking with one another brings out the temporality of the human condition in its duality, and in our responsibility. Clocks no longer measure the time of such talk. It would also follow that what we are talking about can only become and remain a pressing issue, the direct focus of our concern, in language, namely in the talking, although also in the reading and writing. Information, results of research, doctrines of the church, ideologies of nations, even the texts of poets and philosophers stand independently of our own talk and speech. We can refer to them in their independence. But we cannot refer to the sense we make of these. We can only talk it up, create it, maintain it. What we say can make sense only in the saying of it. Once there is, our talk enacts the drama. Embodies for a while the difference, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the duality of the human condition itself, the past as a pregnancy, the future as a recovery, the present as midwifery. If to be human is to be a zoon logon echon, an animal possessing logos, whatever that means. Does it mean reason? Maybe. In a sense, it means reason, but it means speech. It means reason in the way that reason appears in speech. To be alive by virtue of language. That's a loose translation, but in some sense maybe captures the sense better. To be alive by virtue of language as a translation of zoon logon echon, because zoon, which means animal, comes from zoe, which means life. To be alive by virtue of language. It is perhaps because we find ourselves ultimately destined to create and preserve a sense of various things which only make sense in our talk with one another, either face to face or in reading and writing, because we are in making our life in language as much as, or even more than, in making a living with our hands. Such linguistic making, whether in our dealings with our children, our parents, our students, our teachers, our colleagues, friends, or lovers, gives momentary shape to a coalescence of past and future, which has the magical property of falling apart the moment we cease putting it together. Unlike, say, a house, which only gradually deteriorates once we have ceased maintaining it. That's an interesting way to think about it. That that the kind of ephemerality of talk is something that distinguishes it from other kinds of human endeavor that kind of can stand independently, that can stand independently in time. They don't need our time to kind of keep them active. I'd never thought about it quite like that, but I do think there's something to that. In short, talking with one another is an art which we must learn and exercise. Playing with proposals, in ignorance of where they might lead, we must still create and preserve a life in language. And we easily fail, indeed as in any art, whether that of talking, that of woodcutting, or that of governing an institution. We more easily point out the sure roads to failure, while success invites participation rather than description. One elementary way of going wrong is to withdraw into the claim that the most important things defy discourse. A dunaton in classical rhetoric. There's a figure of speech which is kind of doing this. I don't think every figure of speech participates in this attitude. It can be a kind of part of a discourse but it's something where you say like a dunaton, which literally means impossibility. Kind of say it's the horror is too great for words. It goes beyond speech, or her virtue. I couldn't thank. Often, actually, where you see this is in thank yous today, where people will say, No words will suffice to express my gratitude. This is a kind of a dun and dun. But there's another way that people do this, where they kind of take this as a general, a Weltanschauung, Weltanschauung of, where they kind of are romantics in a sense, or in another sense, realists too might say this. The romantic sensibility of being like the truth of the heart, no words can express the kind of inner devotion that I feel. They really believe that to be the case, that what is true is beyond language, that language can't express what is best, most beautiful, that's just kind of independent from language in its truth and how we feel it. And there might be the realist way of saying, well, words are kind of bad approximations of what's really there, the kickable stuff out in the world. If by effable we mean capable of fixed and final formulation, so ineffable, what can't be said, so effable, what can be said, we mean capable of fixed and final formulation, then paradoxically, anything worth talking about with one another is ineffable. So he concedes part of the point, but he's changing the meaning of it here. Like, sure, of course, it's never going to be that you say it and that it's done. That's not what we're talking about. But that's misunderstanding talking. Talking is something we can or must do. No genuine talk puts an end to talking. It always marks a beginning. As I was saying at this beginning of this stream, that's how you feel at the end of a good conversation, like you're just at the beginning of it. Thus, we cannot formulate anything of significance in a way that can force our interlocutor to agree or applaud. Quite the contrary, in genuinely talking with one another, we already encourage in our interlocutor the exercise of his freedom. And we even find that we ourselves say we must say over and over again in varying ways. Anything definite today becomes indefinite tomorrow. The life we would create in language is temporal. We must maintain it in time. Another way of going wrong is to insist that our interlocutor take the entire responsibility for his proposals. This is perhaps the sin of old age, or at least of fatigue. The tired speaker lards everything he says with a heavy irony, throwing the ball so much into the camp of the listener that no play is possible. On the other hand, the tired listener lies back and presumes throughout that the speaker's job is to work out and defend a proposal which he, the listener, can then examine for cracks or leaks, exacerbating rather than mending those discovered. Such discourse we all recognize as more or less sordid, and the implied or manifest disrespect for the autonomy of one's interlocutor may lead us to appreciate the social virtue of courtesy. However, both heavy irony and nasty criticism presuppose a solipsism of discourse, and therefore violate the very conditions of talking with one another. I think I agree here in part with the thrust of what he's saying. But he gets away with a lot by kind of using these descriptions ahead of it. Heavy irony. Well, irony certainly has an important place in real talk. Nasty's criticism. Well, criticism has a very important place in real talk. So these terms don't tell me as much as I would hope from me, because I think this is a really nice piece, but I do have my moments of hopefully not too nasty criticism of it. These don't tell us too much about the problem that he's supposing. It's better described in this way, that the solipsism of discourse is itself the problem. And we can kind of avoid the misleading idea that irony or criticism would be the problem. I don't think that's the case at all. Both speaker and listener are totally responsible, and the realization of this responsibility begins and, in one sense, stays at home. I wouldn't know if that's the most fun way to begin a conversation. We are both totally responsible for this discourse we are about to have. It might be true in some kind of ethical way, but maybe best touched on lightly. Okay. A third sin against dialogue is to make out the extraordinary as a mere complicated or camouflaged ordinary. It's like when people sometimes on these like cooking shows where people will like make a fancy dessert, and they'll just spin a bunch of sugar on top of it. That kind of it's extraordinary. What an extraordinary sundae that you just put a bunch of sugar on. But you made it like, fancy looking. That's not what he means by the extraordinary. To argue that the intent to talk science or to talk religion or to talk politics, art, literature, or whatever is most genuinely to highlight common sense, what goes on all the time, what everyone knows. There are some kinds of people who are prone to talking this way. Who'll tell you it's just common sense, or everyone knows that. They're kind of pundits or talking heads who like to put forward a view as being obvious or commonsensical, as a way of degrading or denigrating the possibility of what we make of the facts, which is, for Welch, as we read in the beginning of this essay, the condition of good, real talk. That there is an openness in what we can make of things. After all, a good talk reveals something. We take up a topic, for example, scientific research into chemical bonding, the conditions for salvation as laid down in the Gospels, the claims of modern democracy. From the immediate standpoint of the discussants, these topics are given. That is, there is a common or ordinary way in which the results, the doctrines, the ideologies appear at any given moment to given people in history. We may, in the course of the discussion, discover that these commonplaces, here he's kind of tipping his hat to this rhetorical idea of the commonplaces as these doxa, these endoxa, these things that appear to people as probable. They're what the way things tend to appear to people in some particular historical location, at some particular moment in time, are already syntheses of some sort, that they are as we have already categorized them, as Kant was bent on arguing out, and that we can know them only to the extent that human beings have made them, as Vico insisted. And Vico has this idea of the verum factum, that the thing that we know, or that the thing that we're capable of knowing something because we can make it. You're like, oh, you know how a toaster works? Make one. Okay, well, you can actually make one. So you actually can know how a toaster works. You can make a mathematical diagram so you know what that means. But you can't make a tree. At least he didn't think we could. We might be able to now. So you can't really know a tree in the way that you know other things. You might know things about the tree because you can make things out of it. But anyway, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But indeed, in a good talk, we can first come to the fullest realization, if only for a moment, of the synthesis. Because for the first time, we are the ones who are now making something out of them, discovering the process that a given only is in such making. However, this discovery is only one of the many to which a dialogue can lead. More a platform for launching other and higher flights. For in talking with one another genuinely, in playing with proposals intently and informedly, but also ignorantly, we discover too the field on which we are playing, the topic of the discourse, emerging again as new rather than simply old and established, as sustaining rather than simply prevailing, as the prior place in which we have to reside without acknowledging its priority over and claim upon us. Nature reemerges as demanding certain kinds of responsible, synthetic efforts. All creation reemerges as ultimately sacred. Our social and political context reemerges as entailing our current participation. In all cases, the place, our environment, comes into its own in varying and ever-renewed ways, whether as nature, creation, or community. We get a sense of connectedness, you might say. Put it a little more plainly. We feel connected to things. And to things that might not be just those that we're talking to, not just the people we're talking to. We feel connected to the matter that we talk of and its possibilities, which are around us. They are our environment. Our ancestors understood the task of talking as the task of discovering a topic, a place in Greek, or coming into a locus, inventing it in Latin. What we tend to forget is that the discovery or invention of a topic or a locus occurs as a resurgence of the place itself, no longer as ordinary or common. Witness the change of the word commonplace from shared focus to banal remark. Any effort to reduce the discovery or invention to the ordinary, namely by trying to show that whatever might be said simply builds upon or distorts common sense, in the contemporary sense, bespeaks an effort to put an end to the talk. A drive to talk only so long as somebody happens to advance a weird proposal challenging such reduction. It has to be something has to kind of go wonky for things to get interesting. Wittgenstein has proven most adept at such reduction in the intellectual domain, improving upon the more common propensity simply to assert and demand it. In claiming that revealing is basically unconcealing, Heidegger reinterprets, in rather forceful terms, Aristotle's claim that self-generating vision, eidos, inherent in any topic, is prior to its initial presentation, hule, and which can also mean like the matter of something. So it's like form and matter, which are these ideas that appear a lot in Aristotle, because he kind of thinks things come into being by having form and matter, even things that are not, in our sense, material, like ideas. You know. And Hegel's point that insight requires us to aufheben whatever simply prevails. Kind of, we have to synthesize. When we were talking before about dialectic, this is one of Hegel's dialectical ideas, the Aufhebung, the kind of lifting up and synthesizing the conflict between something and its negation. That it doesn't it's not like matter and antimatter. They come together and they just disintegrate each other. There's nothing left. That in talk, when something encounters its negative, something actually is left. And that thing is actually a development of the idea. And we need to kind of, that's what keeps the talk going. To paraphrase Heraclitus, fragment 89, while much talk lets us slip back into our established realms, a good talk leads us out into a realm, topic, or place which focuses joint attention because it is emerging. Or, talking provides the opportunity to shake monological reduction and engage in dialogical induction. Stop monologuing. Let's talk. Okay. I probably won't read the whole thing tonight, but I think we can read a bit more. Thank you for whoever's watching. If you have things to say, you can chat. Be interested to know what you think about all of this. The third sin, certainly a cardinal one, begs for further illustration, being itself the background for much good talk, especially in the academic household, where we ourselves run the greatest risk of committing it. The temptation arises most obviously because much intellectual talk has as its formal topic an established literature, the works of authors whose earthly remains lie buried in some far-off place, and whose spiritual remains now survive in libraries, bookstores, and briefcases. We generally admit that these spiritual remains, these survivors of the spirit, also require something like resuscitation, if not resurrection. The existence of educational institutions devoted to the humanities bespeaks such an admission already. Well, not sure. This was written a long time ago. Not sure we can be so confident in that anymore. Alas. And a good deal of intellectual work during the last century, currently proceeding under the rubric hermeneutics, has called attention to the peculiarities of such resuscitation. Evidently, the spiritual remains of bygone ages defy our understanding either partly or absolutely, temporarily or eternally. We often hear it is said that the difficulty or impossibility arises because any given spirit responds to its age, either creatively or slavishly, and is only as this response, now necessarily exiled from its truest home. There's much we could talk about in these paradoxes of historicism. However, my only point here is that these paradoxes easily engendered the sin in question, no matter how we unravel them. For the greatest challenge in talking about the established literature of our tradition lies in the nature of great literature itself, not in historical distance. It bids us to play with proposals, therefore to accept our ignorance. Not our ignorance of what already is, but our ignorance of what might be made of what already is. And this is something that comes up a lot. I mean, for me, and he is talking about liberal arts and humanities institutions. And this is, I think, I have to say, one of the reasons why humanistic education is valuable, because you do this a lot. You confront this a lot, where you have, well, hopefully, I mean, I know that there are many people in the humanities who kind of teach these things as authorities in this very, very old-fashioned way, thinking they're quite cutting edge. The latest research on why you should interpret Plato or Kant authoritatively, or whoever. But a lot of the value in reading these things comes from the fact that there's so much that can be made of them that's different, and it can lead us to very, very serious, very real, but hopefully also humorous talk. That's where we practice doing that. But how much can you pay for that? How much time can you afford? there are real questions pressing in on people's lives about this. So, I don't know. Maybe you can come to Twitch. Please give me a follow. This is a place where you might do it. I don't know. I don't know where we can talk. I don't know where we can talk today. This might be one place. Trying it out. We'll see how it goes. It's a bit weird. I'm not sure how I feel about it. But I don't know. I think there's something to all these different places. It doesn't have to be done in a college classroom. It can be done on the bus. It can be done over a chessboard. It can be done in bed. There's lots of places where this kind of talk can happen for people. For the one right way can never be our answer, namely, an answering up to the topic itself. Rather, the one right way must claim to capture the answer proffered by the text, more exactly by the author. Well, what did Plato really mean? What does the Bible really say? This kind of stuff. Yeah, no. Get that out of here. That's not how it goes. That's not how it works. And people think that if you say, oh, that's not, there isn't one right way, they think, oh, well then, anything goes. It's all arbitrary with you. No, not at all. It's arbitrary with you when you say there's one right way. That's the arbitrary move. When you have to defend and articulate what you make of something, you have to give reasons and evidence. Show what it means to stand where you stand on that. That's a lot more difficult, takes more work, but it's also much more enjoyable than people just making these assertions. To be sure, a text can be established, but never its discourse, unless we consent to reduce a discourse to an array of answers, something students initially do, and also professors who never learned the difference, or who did and then gave in to student demands. I feel like the majority, though, probably this. Because you know who becomes professors? Good, quote-unquote, students. And therein lies much of the problem. Talking about real talk. In any case, once we reduce a work to a series of right readings, all talk about it henceforth presupposes that the topic is established in principle. Such talk can embody learnedness, but never learning. In it, we can lecture or take notes, but we cannot talk with one another, cannot face together a topic emerging. You might say, we can't really think. And given the social pressures of academia, we constantly enter into the temptation to prefer a clearly stated, even if untenable answer to a darkly articulated, because thought-provoking question. For the one looks like a claim to knowledge, whereas the other presupposes an acknowledgement of ignorance. And we're right back to where we began, which is, what's the place of ignorance in education? And if it's just to get rid of it, it's like, one of those paper towel commercials where they're like, here's how we get rid of that gunk on your floor. And the shiniest educational institution just gets it all up. No ignorance left. You're educated now. No ignorance. Then we're educating people into this banality. We're doing real violence with this kind of education. And perhaps, he's not going quite this far, but I really think you're kind of creating an intellectual army of mercenaries and functionaries when you do that. Because what is the value of knowledge coming from when people think this way? I think it comes from how effectively you can execute the values of an institution. How well you can serve power. But you might ask, how does a genuine conversation get started? Certainly not simply by each of us admitting ignorance and expecting help from the other. Rather, each of us must believe something, must be prepared to take the lead in proposing something. For only then can there be a ball with which to play. If in apparent humility all of us prefer to probe rather than present a proposal, we all sit in the bleachers to comment on a game which others have played. Those with whom we do not even try to talk. Those at whom we at most shout. This is like Twitter. Where there's just a whole crew of people who are there to probe but never propose. In discourse, humility without leadership is only a euphemism for thoughtlessness and cowardice. Evidently, we must have the courage to speak up and also the courage to reply. Why courage? Well, we might get a tongue lashing for our trouble, or fall into a fruitless exchange of fire. But perhaps the greatest danger, often unacknowledged, is that either an opener or a reply may leave one running with a ball gamelessly. Not aimlessly, gamelessly. What are we playing? Calvin ball. Go back, Calvin and Hobbes. No, that's like the ultimate game where the game is the rules of the game itself. Gamelessly is like such a nice use of the weird things you can do with an adverb in English. Gamelessly. So that what began as talk peters out into an assertion of a view. We damage the talk of others most effectively by casting it back on itself, cutting off what philosophers have sometimes called its intentionality, something both politeness and nastiness equally do. You know how you can kind of kill someone with politeness? You can kind of just be like so civil to show your contempt. People in the American South have kind of perfected this. They call it nasty nice, which combines the kind of the coolness of politeness and the kind of sunny lack of care with the enjoyment of a malicious and sometimes cruel Schadenfreude. I don't know how else to put it. Yeah. On the other hand, we do justice to the speech of others, preserving it as dialogue, perhaps even converting it into dialogue by taking issue with it, taking up the issue to which it refers, thereby conserving the referred within the referring. Something that makes me think of this is I had one student last semester. So last semester only? Wow. I guess it was. And he was great. I really liked his presence in class. And one of the things that he brought to class was this claim that became almost like a catchword of his. And I wouldn't kind of call it a joke in the class because it was seriously meant and responded to with sometimes vehement passions by others, where he'd be like, well, that's just subjective, which was great because in kind of railing against the subjective, he brought the kind of most subjective point of view into the class and made it dynamic in a way that we couldn't have if everyone was like, yes, it is subjective. So it was a really beautiful paradox that I really enjoyed in this class, where we got to the kind of genuine subjectivity of discourse by someone being like, no, that's just subjective. And I thought that was great. As a conversation begins, so it continues, by each becoming the leader. In talking with our children or with our students, the task of leadership becomes accentuated. My job as a parent or as a teacher requires me to talk in such a way that others can and will talk. Education consists in getting others to take the lead, a getting which itself requires leadership. Still, it is peculiar to suggest that everybody can be a leader. In typical organized human efforts, some lead, others follow. However, in talking with one another, perhaps even in the best of organizations, the issue itself takes precedence. We're kind of led by what we're talking about, if things are going well. The topic leads, ultimately. Because each of us follows what is being talked about, each steps ahead of the others. I like that. I like that image. I have to think about that one. Thus, the aptness as a motto for a co-authored work of the lines from the Iliad, Book 10, those lines. When two go together, one sees before the other, so that the best may come to be. Alone, one might see, but one's sight is shorter and one's discernment limited. That's very nice. I think that might be a nice place to leave it off for tonight, because while I think it's been an engaging 13 pages, I don't want to become one of those tired speakers that falls into hard irony, or whatever he called it, heavy irony. Don't want to do that. But thank you for joining me tonight for this first part of reading Cyril Welch's work, published in 85, Talking. For talking a bit about talking, or listening. But as he would say, if you were really listening, as I was trying to really talk, we were both participating, even though the chat was pretty quiet tonight. There will be another version of this on YouTube, and later a stream where I'll finish reading this, and that will also appear on YouTube. If you want to listen to this later, you can go to the YouTube channel, which you can find on my page, but is also just called Rhetoric Prof. If you search it, you'll probably find it. Thanks again for talking with me tonight. See you next time.